Can you confirm we're up and running? Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another live episode of The Breakdown. We're a couple of days late, but with very good reason. This is an episode that we wanted to make absolutely certain that we didn't get wrong because, oh boy, there's just so much to unpack here. We're only going to be doing one topic tonight. We're only going to be talking about one thing. And I should probably just put it right at the beginning of the show. Trigger warning. Because we're going to be talking about a lot of sensitive issues. There's been some pretty significant discussion that's gone on in the background putting this episode together. And we want to throw it out there out front. We've reached out to a couple of folks from the trans community. We're going to be sitting down with them, and we're doing it after this episode. We're doing it very deliberately because, you know, we're not perfect. We're not journalists. We do our best with the resources that we have. But if we get anything wrong, we want to make sure that we can be corrected on that. So we're going to be having some conversations with some pretty amazing folks who have been generous enough to agree to have conversations with us, because God knows this problem is not going to go away anytime soon. Now, all of that being said, we're going to have a little fun to start with, because the rest of it, man, if y'all thought the Tucker Carlson thing was a march, I'm really selling it out of the gates, but we're gonna have some fun right out of the gates. There's been a lot of social media activity since Danielle Smith made her announcement, and one of the things that we keep hearing on all of our social media platforms is from people who are concerned that the breakdown as an entity with the massive political sway that we have is for some reason looking to mutilate the genitals of children. We're not, and we just want to make it clear to everyone who's concerned about where the breakdown stands on that. We don't want to mutilate children's genitals. Apparently, there's only some Jews, Christians, and Muslims who want to mutilate some children's genitals. You can reverse search that image if you want to. But moving on from there, like I said, we're going to alienate everybody tonight is the goal. Moving on from there, we also wanted to start and set the stage appropriately, because there's been a lot of questions about the policy announcements that have gone on this week. There's been a lot of questions about what the motivations are. There's been a lot of questions about where the information's coming from. So we wanted to start with our favorite clip of the Danielle Smith administration, if you will, to really make sure that we set the tone properly?
Protector evolved over time?
I tend to be pretty trusting.
We wanted to start with that one because tonight, on a very special episode of The Breakdown, and by request from a few folks, which is kind of wild, we are going to fact check the Premier of Alberta. We're going to fact check Danielle Smith, and we're going to start with the video that she released last week, January 31st. Danielle Smith released a video on social media. She didn't stand up in front of cameras to answer questions right away. No. She had a video that she wanted to release to introduce Albertans to some new Let's Go With policies. And, say what you will about the video. It was incredibly produced. Danielle Smith was at the top of her game. As some people have observed, Danielle Smith was in the environment in which she's most dangerous because she was reading from a script and she was speaking to Albertans. And we're going to let the introduction kind of speak for itself.
That list of adult choices includes deciding whether or not to alter one's biological sex. Making permanent and irreversible decisions regarding one's biological sex while still a youth can severely limit that child's choices in the future. Prematurely encouraging or enabling children to alter their very biology or natural growth, no matter how well-intentioned and sincere, poses a risk to that child's future that I, as Premier, am not comfortable with permitting in our province. Similarly, the risks and unfair advantages that young women and girls are experiencing when competing with biologically stronger transgender females in sporting competitions have also grown too high.
We got the soft lighting. We got the nice pastel-y, not too overwhelming painting in the background. We got the gentle pluckings of a guitar, Alberta style. Really, the only thing that this video is missing is a sad puppy and a Sarah McLachlan song playing in the background, because that's entirely the tone that was set from the beginning and all the way through the video. And it was, to Danielle Smith's credit, expertly delivered. It was. You can't get around that. And you can't get around how powerful, and as some people, like I said earlier, have pointed out, dangerous this video could be. Because if you're not familiar with the subject matter, if you're not familiar with the background, if you're not aware of the fact that Danielle Smith lies a lot, and she's going to lie to you a lot in this video, then it would be very, very easy to think, oh, this is a wonderful video. I'm just relaxed. I'll get some tea. I'll curl up by the fireplace. Perhaps I'll invest in a timeshare. This is just delightful. But the reality is that when we get to the policy, when we get to the messaging, when we get to what Danielle Smith actually announced, it shouldn't have been an acoustic guitar. It probably should have been a very loud klaxon.
On the issue of gender reassignment treatments for minors. For minors aged 17 and under, top and bottom gender reassignment surgeries will not be permitted. For children aged 15 and under, puberty blockers and hormone therapies for the purpose of gender reassignment or affirmation will also not be permitted, with the exception of those who've already commenced their treatment at this time.
Now, there's a lot to unpack right in that first little section. That video clip, for the record, is only about 30 seconds long. But Danielle Smith managed to unload an incredible amount, as well as take advantage of some misconceptions that exist. So first of all, she says, you know what, going forward, top and bottom surgeries, it's not going to happen anymore. We're going to ban it. Top and bottom surgeries under 17. It's not going to happen. Now, there's some interesting wordplay that's going on there, because Danielle Smith is not saying we will only allow top or bottom surgeries for people over the age of 18. They're deliberately going with the smaller number because it makes it sound younger, don't you see? So right out of the gates, we've got some manipulation going on, but we've also got some much bigger pieces of manipulation going on, because there's some nuance here. And we're not even into the puberty blockers yet. We're just talking about the top and bottom surgery so far. So what Danielle Smith doesn't say in that video is that you can't get bottom surgery until you're over 18 anyways. So this is issuing a ban to support, I guess, at the most generous interpretation, something that's already in practice. There are no kids getting bottom surgery under the age of 18. It's not a thing that happens. It's not a thing that happens anywhere in Canada. Now, when we start to talk about top surgeries, then things get a little bit more complicated. Fortunately, there's an intrepid journalist named Tyler Dawson who's been doing quite a bit of digging over the last week. And one of the things that he was able to identify is that in 2022, there were 26 top surgeries performed for people under the age of 18. In 2023, there were 23. Now, before we get to how significant that actually is, one of the things that's really important to highlight is there's lots of different reasons why people get top surgeries or mastectomies or double mastectomies. People get them because they're diagnosed with breast cancer. And that does happen to people under the age of 18. People get them because they're dealing with issues of severe and chronic pain. That does happen too. Now, earlier in the week, it was reported that there were, like I said, this 26 and 23 numbers, 26 in 2022, 23 in 2023. Earlier in the week, it was reported that the government didn't actually keep track of how many were actually for gender-affirming care, which caused a lot of speculation because people were like, well, were there any? There's all of these other medical reasons. I only listed off two, but there's all of these other medical reasons why people get top surgery. Maybe it was one of those. Well, literally an hour before we came to air, Tyler Dawson updated his investigatory work. And it turns out that from what we can tell, 2022, of the 26 top surgeries that were performed in the province of Alberta, 8 of them were for gender-affirming care for somebody under the age of 18. 8. We're not even in the double digits. We're talking about 8. That's it. That's the whole ballgame. So banning top surgeries for people 17 and under the age of 18, is not just disingenuous because there's no bottom surgeries happen, but we're also talking about a statistically irrelevant number of surgeries. This is not a massive thing that's happening where kids are being shuttled into these surgical farms and having bits lopped off. That's simply not happening in the province of Alberta. Another way to say this is that in 2022, there were 8 gender-affirming surgeries done for people under the age of 18. Now, he hasn't gotten the numbers for 2023. We will absolutely do our best to amplify that when it comes around. But that's a really important place to start. Now, that being said, we got to move on to the other thing that Danielle Smith decided that she was gonna talk about in that. And that's where she talked about the puberty blockers piece. I want to make sure I get this right. But when she's talking about the puberty blockers, what she's talking about is a type of medication. And that medication's job is to, as the name describes, block puberty. That's it. And there's a lot of different reasons to potentially block puberty, especially when somebody has identified that they believe that they are trans. They believe that they are born in the wrong body. And they have been assessed by a psychologist. And they have been assessed by a physician. Professionals, experts, if you will. There's good reasons to use puberty blockers. First of all, puberty blockers aren't permanent. They're largely reversible. So you stop taking the puberty blockers and the puberty comes back. But what it does do is it prevents breast development. It prevents a lot of the hair development. So it pushes pause. And that's a really good opportunity for a trans kid to live in the gender that they are. without having to worry about all of the side effects that come with puberty. Not only that, but it saves them a lot of hassle on surgeries down the road, reconstructive surgeries down the road. It's a good thing. And what Danielle Smith has done here with puberty blockers isn't, she says, oh, you got to be under the age of 15. Puberty started by 15. And for a lot of kids, puberty is pretty advanced by 15. So when we're talking about taking puberty blockers and restricting them for the kids who are going to be entering puberty, you're removing the viability, the whole purpose of puberty blockers being a thing in the scope of trans treatment. So it's very disingenuous for her to say, hey, you know what? We're gonna put a buzz out of those puberty blockers, because at that point in time, that kid will be affected by puberty, and the whole point of having puberty blockers goes right out the window. That's just the first 30 seconds of the policies, by the way. We're going to go through a couple of press conferences, too, so strap in, make some popcorn, do what you need to do. But she also talked about hormone replacement therapy.
Age 16 and 17 will be permitted to commence hormone therapies for gender reassignment and affirmation purposes, so long as they are deemed mature enough to make these decisions and have parental, physician, and psychologist approval.
So they can start hormone replacement therapy as long as they have physician approval and psychologist approval, which is exactly the same thing that exists right now. So the big change, though, is Danielle Smith has decided that she's going to put a number attached to that. So regardless of what that physician or that psychologist believe, regardless of whether or not that kid could have accessed puberty blockers earlier, Danielle Smith has said, no, you can't start it until then with her vast amount of medical expertise. She has none. She has no medical expertise that has ever been identified. So, that's important to consider too. But here's the big thing to understand about this chunk of policies. Danielle Smith didn't just, and I do not for 1 second want to sound like I'm minimizing the impact on trans kids that these policies are going to have, because there are advocates and people with lived experience who have spoken much more passionately and eloquently than I'll ever be able to. So I'm not trying to minimize that, but it is important to realize that what Danielle Smith did is she put a great big target up on the wall. And at the very center of that target, the thing that she wants everyone aiming for is the trans kids piece. And we're going to get into how irresponsible that is and the types of things that can trigger in a bit. But it's also really important as we work our way through this video presentation or CPR course ever, I don't know what we want to call it, that we keep it in context of there's a lot of other moving parts that are going on here as well. And one of those other really important moving parts has to do with the classroom instruction that has nothing to do with the trans piece.
Classroom instruction on subject matter involving gender identity, sexual orientation, or human sexuality, we will be requiring parental notification and an opt-in requirement for each instance a teacher intends to give formal instruction on these subjects. Furthermore, all third-party resource materials or presentations related to gender identity, sexual orientation, or human sexuality in our K through 12 school system will need to be pre-approved by the Ministry of Education to ensure the materials are age-appropriate.
So, right out of the gates there, now we're saying that when it comes to classroom instruction, any time that there's a mention of human sexuality or gender identity or anything like that, teachers have to give parents notice, and they have to get an opt-in policy. Now, this gets really complicated for a lot of reasons. One of the biggest ones is teachers are already facing an incredible administrative burden. We've talked about this on many episodes of the show before, where we've highlighted the fact that teachers are spending less and less time teaching kids and more time dealing with administrative stuff. And not only is that a big contributor to teacher burnout, but it's taking teachers away from doing what they signed up to do. If somebody wanted to be an administrator, one could presume they would go to, I don't know, administrator school or something. Somebody wants to be a teacher, they want to teach kids. And the administrative burden that's going on in classrooms right now is causing a tremendous amount of teacher burnout. The ATA has raised the alarm on this multiple times. Danielle Smith's response to the shortage of teachers that the province is currently facing and the administrative burnout and all of the other things is to say, hey, you know what? We're going to place this incredibly gargantuan administrative chunk right in the middle of your plate. Oh, and by the way, if there's any third-party materials that we're going to use, that has to be approved by the ministry. And this is another important piece because there are schools that show the movie Avatar. And there are a lot of people who look at that movie and they go, oh, those aliens, they're in loincloths. I'm not too sure how I feel about that. That feels like it might have a little bit to do with the sex. I don't know about that. That's somebody who could presumably make a complaint that this teacher didn't provide the opt-in policy for the specific sexual element of Avatar or anything else. Everything now has to be approved by the Ministry of Education. And that really forces the question, what infrastructure exists in the Ministry of Education to provide the kind of review and approval that we're talking about here? We've seen multiple curriculum rollouts from the provincial government that have been unmitigated train wrecks because they haven't engaged with the actual experts. They haven't engaged with the actual subject matter experts, or the people who know about pedagogy or curriculum or any of those things. They just do what they want. And that's not great. Because what this policy could potentially end up doing is restricting kids' access to sex ed. And the evidence on sex ed is incredibly clear. If you don't provide sex eds to kids, teen pregnancies go up. STIs, or sexually transmitted infections, go up. All of the bad things that everybody's terrified about when it comes to sex, all of those things happen more frequently because kids don't have anywhere to access reliable information. And as Ryan Jasperson pointed out somewhat bluntly earlier this week, we don't want kids relying only on the internet to learn about these things. But that is just the start of what's going on in the classroom. There's another piece.
Age 15 and under, the government will require parental notification and consent for a school to alter the name or pronouns of a child. For 16 and 17-year-olds who choose to alter their name or pronouns, parents do not need to give consent, but they must be notified. We know that nearly all parents, even those who may disagree with the decision of their children, will love and care for their children no matter what choices they make. However, in the handful of rare situations where one or both of the parents reject or become abusive to a child who identifies as transgender, we have child protection laws that will be strictly enforced.
Oh, so they'll enforce the law after the kid's been beat or killed or abused or. The greater issue here is that there have been plenty of studies done. And there's some good news that for sure comes out of those studies. We're going to throw a slide up on the screen right now that talks about some of the good news that exists. This is from a study that was done in 2021 in Canada. So this is a Canadian-specific study. It's fairly 2021 for academic studies is about as fresh as you get because those academics, they do take their time. 62% of kids reported strong parental gender support. And that's great because 62% of kids get good support from their parents. Of that 62%, 91.9 identified their parents as being those support people. So for 62% of kids, their parents are great. But here's the problem. There's another part of that number. What that means is 28% of kids don't get that level of support. The 28% of kids who are afraid to tell their parents for whatever reason, whether it's religious or cultural or just plain old-fashioned bigotry, these kids are afraid. They don't feel like they have the support of their parents. We're not talking about a small number. Now, I've said it many times on the show before, and God knows as this topic continues to rear its unnecessary and ugly head, I'm going to have to keep repeating it. I am a parent. And I believe with everything that I've got, that it's my job to let my kids know my biggest concerns for them are I want them to be healthy and happy. It's my job as a parent to build a relationship with my kids where they can feel safe and where they trust me with whatever they need to trust me with. And because I want nothing but the best for my kids, if there is some area where I have not been able to do that and they do choose to go to a trusted person, I'm okay with that. Because my kids aren't little remote control cars that I get to control. To be clear, if you have failed to build a relationship with your kids where they feel like they're part of that 62%, that's on you, period. And that failure is not something that your child should have to bear without supports. That's exactly what this policy does. And I have to say, again, it's incredibly bizarre to me that Smith would make the announcement that, oh, you know what we're going to do? We're going to enforce those child protection laws. Have we not been? Have we just been whiffing on that this entire time? But again, this is part of that communication package that this whole video represents. Because this is Smith saying, hey, you know what, guys, here's all the wonderful things we're going to do. And we have all of these great safety nets. And I'm speaking in a really soft voice. And any minute, I swear, Sarah McLachlan's going to come on. She's going to do a little number behind us. Isn't this comforting and relaxing and not at all scary? That's what it's designed to do. But the parental notification thing is absolutely going to put kids at risk. And as many experts and people with lived experience in the LGBTQ2S plus community have said, for that 28% that don't enjoy that relationship with their parents where they feel supported, it will result in kids being put out on the streets. It will result in kids being beat. And it will result in kids dying. The evidence of all of those things is overwhelming and it's demonstrated. And the fact that Smith is apparently comfortable turning a blind eye to these things is one of the things that people have struggled with and been most stunned by. Because the evidence is in. And especially when we're talking about trans youth, they are some of the most vulnerable to all of those horrible things that I just listed off. But of course, Smith wasn't done there.
Needs to deal with the emerging issue of the unfair disadvantages that young women and girls are experiencing when competing with biologically stronger transgender female athletes in sporting competitions. I strongly believe that those who were born male but have transitioned to or identify as female are owed the opportunity to meaningfully participate in sport. However, there are obvious biological realities that give transgender female athletes a massive competitive advantage over women and girls. It is not beneficial for those women, including those who are transgender, for this divisive and sometimes dangerous situation to continue. That is why the Alberta government will work with sporting organizations active in our province to ensure that women and girls have the choice to compete in a women's-only division in athletic competitions and are not forced to compete against biologically stronger transgender female athletes. We will also work with those same sporting organizations to ensure transgender athletes are able to meaningfully participate in the sport of their choice through the expansion of co-ed or other gender-neutral divisions for athletic competitions.
Now, again, there's a lot to unpack here. The first piece that we have to ask is Danielle Smith says girls are experiencing this. In the province of Alberta, girls are experiencing the unfairness of having to compete against transgender girls. And that's just so unfair. If only there was some sort of medication that would prevent the advantages that puberty offers in the teenage pubescent population. If only there was some sort of blocker of puberty that hadn't just been, made illegal by Smith's government. Perhaps this wouldn't be an issue till at least age 15 or 16. But there's not anymore. Now, we're going to talk more about the sports piece because there is actually a lot of data that speaks to this. But it's also important to highlight that what Smith has just done with that little decree of hers, for the libertarian premier who believes in small government, what she's done is she's turned around and she said to every sporting organization, most of which are private, by the way, that you now have to have. We're going to come in, we're going to step in, and we're going to say this is how your private sporting organization needs to be organized. This is unprecedented. Quite literally. At least in Canada. Because private organizations are private organizations. They're private clubs. And if somebody wants to play in a private rugby league, then they're playing in a private rugby league. And what right does the government have to step in and say, hey, you know what? You've been doing things in a way that I guess has been working for you, but we just don't like it anymore. Never mind the fact that when we're talking about the trans population in Alberta, we are talking about an unbelievably small number of the population. You got to put a couple of zeros in before you start to get to numbers when you start to talk about the percentage of the population that is self-identifying as trans. And then when we talk about of that population, how many are actively playing sports, you start to see how ludicrous this gets really, really quickly. But this is a narrative that has been existing in conservative media, right-wing infotainment for quite some time. They've been pitching these stories and they've been selling these stories and they've been building this whole thing up as if it's an actual problem. But the reality is, it's not. It's just not. Several of us on the team looked for examples from Alberta where this has become a problem for any age demographic. And granted, we're not professional researchers, but the reality is we couldn't find any. You can find one or two if you cherry pick on a national scale. But there's always with those stories, there's a lot of incomplete information. But again, Danielle Smith has presented it as, hey, you know what, we want to give this comforting tone, this comforting thing. And then the last part of that particular video that we want to play before we start to get to the press conferences is what we're going to call, tongue-in-cheek, the outro.
Children and teens, that I want to say just how much we love you and support you in becoming the person you want to be. You never have to feel alone or isolated. If you do, reach out to your parents, family members, teachers, a coach, or other trusted adults and ask for support. We, as the adults in your life, will be there for you to make sure you know just how amazing and precious you are. Thank you for listening.
Talk to a grown-up so that we can tell your parents. It's so incredibly insincere for Danielle Smith to stand up and say, hey, you know what, you kids you're so important and you're wonderful and you're all fantastic. And there's unconditional love and support that exists for, what was it again? Oh, yes, 62% of you. And for the 28% of you, well, best of luck, but at least the premier said she loved you in a soft folk music video, I guess. But again, the thing to keep in mind with Danielle Smith's video is that you have to have some knowledge of the background to understand just how much bullshit she managed to pack into that easily listening 8 minutes. Because there was a lot. Now, she released that on the Wednesday, and that was just released into the ether. There was no opportunity for people to ask questions. There was no opportunity for journalists to ask questions. There's no opportunity for Smith to be held to any kind of an account whatsoever. Until the next day, when there was going to be a presser. And we want to share a couple of bits from that presser because, again, there's some straight up falsehoods that we need to address.
Balances. Can you be more specific?
Well, when you begin hormone therapy, there are health consequences associated with that. It is a decision that impacts your life. Higher risk of osteoporosis, so there's a need to have bone density tests. There's higher incidence of heart problems, so there's a need to have that monitored. Stepping on to the next stage, when there's bottom surgery and top surgery, that of course has implications for sex and for fertility. And so when we start down this pathway, we want to make sure that kids know the consequences that it's going to have on their life, and that they're mature enough to be able to make those decisions and live with the consequences. And they're adult decisions, so we want to make sure that certain decisions are made as adults.
As we work our way through these press conferences, one of the things that's going to become very clear is the fact that Danielle Smith is hedging all of these things, all of these treatments and procedures and everything else. She's hedging them all under the guise of, well, people have to make their choices. Let's be clear. Being born in the wrong body isn't a choice. The dissonance that creates isn't a choice. The severity of how much people experience that isn't a choice. We are talking about diagnosable things that have observable organic components. And when I say organic components, that is to say, you can look at a brain and you can see the differences. You also have to recognize that when we're talking about the spectrum of human sex, and when I say that, what I'm referring to is the actual bits, there's a lot of variation. There's a lot of variation in the genetic components, and there's a lot of variation in the physical presentation of those things. It's not binary. And as much as it might be more comfortable for people to think of it that way, that's just not the reality. And anybody who spent any time in any sort of human anatomy and physiology course or human sexuality course would be able to tell you that very easily and very comfortably. But some people don't want to hear that. Some people like simple. And that's what all of this is about. But it's really important to realize it's a medical state. And so to say, well, some of the treatments for this medical state, they come with consequences. And, I just think that you should be an adult to make those consequences. Medications for ADHD, depression, and a variety of other health conditions can cause heart arrhythmias. They can cause high blood pressure. They can cause low blood pressure. They can cause heart attack. They can cause stroke, and they can cause more. We don't withhold those medications from kids who are suffering from ADHD, depression, or other conditions. If a kid's diagnosed with cancer and they're maybe facing an amputation of some kind, we don't say to them, hey, you know what? Maybe you could just hold on till you're 18 when you're an adult and can understand the full consequences, and then we'll have this conversation. That's ludicrous. But for some reason, for Danielle Smith, the medical state that is being a trans person, that, tough it out. We'll see what we see. It's incredibly misinformed. And it's just false. Now, she's right, but not. It's not the hormone replacement therapy that tends to cause the osteoporosis. It can, but more is the puberty blockers, because the puberty blockers prevent that bone densification that happens during puberty. And you can monitor that, and you can do things for it, just like many other side effects from many other medications for many other medical conditions. But this is where Danielle Smith now wants to tell you a story. She wants to share a little anecdote. We're going to be a little selective about the information that she shares, not us, but Danielle Smith is, because that's how you make the best stories.
Consulting with members of the transgender community since the last time I was in politics, and one of the constant things that I hear is how difficult it is to get connected with somebody who understands transgender medicine, the need for ongoing hormone therapy, and managing the health conditions that come from being on a lifetime of hormone therapy. I met with Lois Cardinal, who, as you may know, felt that she was rushed into bottom surgery and is having consequences of that. And her great frustration is that there hasn't been appropriate medical aftercare for that. And so those are the kind of things that I was struck by, is how can we make sure that those who make the choice to go down this pathway to affirm their new identity have the physical support that they need through that process, have doctors who are trained in the type of medicine, have the ability to have those surgeries in province. Right now, we send those individuals to Quebec, and we just don't have the same level of ability to do aftercare. And so we want to attract somebody into our province. We're working on that right now, who can do the surgeries here so the aftercare can be done here. And we also want to develop a registry of doctors who are able to provide this type of treatment long term, so that nobody has to guess whether or not their doctor is educated enough to be able to provide them the care. So I would say that I've been very influenced over many years, talking to many individuals in the transgender community and helping to develop that approach.
See, I've talked to people who have lived through this. I'm just trying to protect the kids. I talked to Lois Cardinal, and she told me the story about how much regret she had when it came to getting her surgery. And what's happening here is a very clever little bit of placement. Now, you might be thinking, Nate, you're reading too much into it, but this is not the first and only time that she referenced Lois Cardinal at all.
Politics for some time, and so I've had transgender constituents before and spoken many times over the years about some of the challenges those who have transitioned faced. And I'm struck particularly by the story of Lois Cardinal, who felt rushed into getting bottom surgery, and then after her surgery, there just wasn't appropriate aftercare. And I thought we've got to be able to remedy that.
It's just we can't have people getting this surgery and getting regrets. And as long as you ignore some pivotal points of Lois Cardinal's story, as told by Lois Cardinal, then it sounds like we're talking about kids who are getting surgery too early, doesn't it? Except Lois Cardinal wasn't diagnosed with gender dysphoria or identified as being trans until she was 19. From an article that she published herself, she says that she got the surgery when she was 21. Now, I want to be clear. There are some elements of Lois's story that are complicated, and it certainly sounds like she was failed at multiple levels. But that doesn't mean that limiting surgeries for people, especially people under the age of 18, is the answer or comparable. Now, Danielle Smith has done a very good job of wrapping this all up in the guise of, well, we're gonna attract a doctor, because doctors love nothing more than when governments who have no medical background, expertise, or evidence inject themselves into their treatment modalities because of populist rhetoric. Doctors love going to places that do that, I'm told. Except no, that's not it. But speaking even broader to the question of regret, there have been studies that have been done on the question of regret too. And the numbers, and again, we're talking about Canadian numbers, the numbers tend to be in the range of 1 to 3%. Now, there's studies that have those numbers as larger numbers, but they also have a lot of other inclusion criteria that invalidate those studies. Those are the studies that are being cherry-picked by a lot of folks right now. But the most recent, highest quality evidence puts the buyer's remorse for transition between 1 and 3%. For some important context, knee replacement surgery sits between 20 and 30% buyer's remorse. And we do a lot more knee replacements in the province of Alberta than we do top surgery, which is the only thing that we do in Alberta. If you want to get bottom surgery, you got to go out of province. So going back to that 8 for people under the age of 18 in 2022, when compared to the number of people who regret getting their knee replacements, what problems are we actually solving here? But Danielle Smith is happy to roll out the lowest cardinal story in an attempt to get people fired up, to get people upset. But there were other questions that came up at these press conferences as well. And it was really quite stunning how dismissive somebody who is a self-proclaimed student of the Charter was about these questions.
In helping to develop that approach.
I talked to a legal expert who said that parental rights are not really a thing in Canada. Children's rights are. They're enshrined in the Charter. How confident are you that these new policies won't violate the Charter and the Canada Health Act as well if you're reducing access to services?
Well, I guess I'll have the lawyers debate that out, but my understanding is that it's pretty well understood that parents are principally responsible for their children up to and including age 15. At age 16 or 17, that's of course when kids develop a little bit more autonomy, and we do have children along that spectrum able to make different types of decisions, and they don't become able to make fully adult decisions on a lot of things until they're 18. So this is why you see in our policy that 16 and 17 is the point at which they can begin the process with input from parents.
Now, this is another place where Danielle Smith's problems with this whole conversation get to be really complicated, because she's disregarding the fact that children's rights are enshrined in the Charter. The way that it's supposed to work is that parents are the custodians of children's rights. They're the ones who are supposed to protect and nurture children's rights. They're not supposed to supersede children's rights with their own things. They're supposed to be protecting those kids' rights and teaching those kids how to use those rights. And that's critically important to understand. But Danielle Smith is disregarding that very simple, foundational tenet of human rights in Canada. And instead saying, the kids, they can't really make the decisions. It's our job to make the decisions. That's what grown-ups are for. And it's not really a fair or accurate assessment of the situation. But as we've seen throughout the show so far, and as we will continue to see, fair and accurate assessments are not particularly Danielle Smith's strong suit. One of the things that she has repeatedly highlighted as this has played out over the last week is the idea of the impact of the decisions.
We're aiming to be supportive of children's rights. We want to make sure that children do not prematurely make decisions that are going to be irreversible and affect their ability to have sex and affect their ability to have children until they're of an age where they're fully responsible for those decisions. That's age 18. So I think that we've struck a reasonable balance, and I would hope that we would get the support of both the medical profession as well as the school community.
So again, there's Danielle Smith presenting it as if it's just a simple choice. It's just a simple yes or no. It's just a simple we're doing this or we're not. It's not like it's a complicated medical state. And it is. And it's really unfortunate that Danielle Smith seems committed to presenting it primarily and repeatedly as if it's a choice and as if she's just trying to bubble wrap kids so they don't make any bad decisions before they're 18. If that was truly the case, one would think somebody like Danielle Smith would be leaning into the notion of expanding sex ed for kids, because it's that sort of thing that allows kids to make sure that they are making safe choices that aren't going to have massive impacts on the rest of their lives. It's a theme that she stayed with throughout that entire press conference.
Certainly do not want children to be making decisions before maybe they've even had sex about whether they want to stop that aspect of their life, or before they've even contemplated whether they want to have kids, to cut off that aspect of their life. I think that as adults, we have an obligation to ensure for kids that they preserve all of those important choices until they're adults, until they're able to make those decisions with the maturity that goes along with that. So that's I think it is supportive, and we want to make sure that in every step of that journey that the kids feel supported by their families and supported by mental health support if that's what they need. But that is, I think that when you're talking about irreversible decisions, that falls into the category of adult choices. And so we want to make sure that they're making those choices as adults.
And again, she's presenting it as if it's something that can just wait. And it's that exact mentality that leads to particularly high levels of kids being at risk for things like suicide. Because people don't treat it as the medical state that it is. People treat it like it's just a phase and that you're just making choices. If we had this conversation in the same context as we have conversations about diabetes or about ADHD or about depression or about anxiety or about cancer or other ailments like that, heart conditions, if we had this conversation in that same frame, it would be a very, very different conversation. And that's the kind of thing that you would typically expect, I don't know, leadership to provide. But that's exactly the opposite of what Danielle Smith actually does. And this is where the arguments started to get really disingenuous in regards to how she was presenting them to people.
Well, we're not stopping any covered service. We do about 100 transgender approvals for surgery every year, and about a quarter of them are aged 18 to 25. Just for context, so that you know, in 2020, 2021, there were 104 individuals approved for surgery, 25 of them 18 to 25. In 21-22 was 119 approved for surgery, 27 in the 18 to 25 category. And I only have partial data for 22-23. It was 19 as of this point in the year that I was looking at, 3 of which were 18 to 25. So that's not going to change. In fact, we're going to provide more support, because rather than sending those individuals to Quebec to get the surgery, we are going to attract a doctor here so the surgeries can be performed here, as well as the aftercare, which is very important in the case of some of the especially the bottom surgery. So there's nothing that's changed there. When it comes to hormone therapies, those are covered by a parent's drug plan. And so, again, those are not therapies that are currently covered by government. They're covered by parents' drug plans. And I would just say that just in the case of the federal government, last year, the federal government passed a new agreement with federal employees for health benefits. And this agreement recognizes that benefits should only apply for gender-affirming procedures for adults 18 years of age or older. So I'm not quite sure why the Minister of Health would take such a strong position.
Because it's not just about the procedures, Dani. And this is again where that manipulation of the facts and the manipulation of where what sits where and the size of the target and what's actually on the target gets to be so important. Because yes, the federal government doesn't provide benefits for procedures like top surgery, like bottom surgery under the age of 18. And again, at this point, I will remind everybody, there were 8 done in the entire province of Alberta. But the other thing that Danielle Smith does here is she talks about, you know what, we're not taking away any covered services. And that's technically true. But the last time that you went to the pharmacy, how much of your prescription was covered by the government of Alberta, assuming you're not on some sort of program, some sort of insurance, whether we're talking about something like Blue Cross or whether we're talking about something like AISH or some sort of external program that covers the costs of your medications. If you've got a kid who's on ADHD meds, you pay for them. If you're on a prescription for something, you pay for it. So to say we're not removing any covered things is technically true, but they are removing the access to the puberty blockers at the ages that it matters the most, where those medications are most relevant. So this isn't just, we're not getting rid of any covered services. You're getting rid of access to those treatments. You're saying to physicians and psychiatrists and the comprehensive team that should exist for these kids that they don't, with the information that they have, they don't get to make the decisions in regards to what they should recommend to this kid and their parents. Because that kid and their parents don't get to make those decisions about their health anymore for no reason other than Dani said so. She can say that she's not removing covered services as much as she'd liked, but the reality is she's removing access to services. And when we're talking about drugs, those aren't covered in the province of Alberta, unless Dani's got some sort of top secret pharmacare plan that she's intending to roll out before this legislation rolls out. That argument has absolutely no legs whatsoever. But again, she really wanted to lean into the whole idea of irreversible, even if it didn't necessarily perfectly apply.
There isn't one single narrative, and there isn't one single answer, and there isn't one single authority that we can rely on this. So a lot of it is going to be looking at the impact on kids. And I think most people would acknowledge that if somebody is making an irreversible decision that could end their ability to have children, that's a decision they should make as an adult. That's certainly the feedback that I've gotten. And it seems to me the most reasonable approach. I should say, I mean, that has been the practice in Alberta, is that you cannot have bottom surgery until you're aged 18 or over. And so as I've been watching around the world, this conversation taking place, we're affirming that practice is going to continue here, that we don't want kids making irreversible decisions before they're adult enough to be able to understand the ramifications and consequences of it. So yes, we're watching the shifting and evolving debate in the medical community with interest, but we think it's important that we set some guidelines so that those who are going through this journey know the decision points where they can commence hormone treatment and where they can commence surgery.
Now, there's some problems with this logic in a pretty big way, because Dani says that the biggest thing that's going to influence her decisions, the biggest thing that's going to influence the policies, the biggest thing that's going to influence the legislation is going to be the impact on kids. But all of the evidence is forcing kids to disclose when they're not prepared to causes very real harm. It puts trans kids at increased risk of death from suicide. It puts them at increased risk of abuse. It puts them at increased risk of houselessness and homelessness. That's all settled. But apparently that's not the kind of impact that we're worried about. But that begs the question, what is the impact that we're worried about? And Dani says, well, the thing that we're most worried about, the thing that we're really concerned about is the whole question of, hey, if this has risks, long-term risks, oh gosh, if this could have life-changing risks, well, we can't trust the kids to make those decisions, and we can't trust the parents to make those decisions. So where does that line start and stop? Does it extend to sports? Does it extend to contact sports? Does it extend to the traumatic brain injuries and the concussions that we see in contact sports? Does it extend to all the broken bones that we see in sports? Does it extend to those things too? Because the risks of those are very clear. They're very well documented, especially the impact of cumulative traumatic brain injury, not only on overall quality of life, but lifestyle. We've certainly seen no shortage of stories who have experienced different levels of severe injury, including paralysis while playing sports. Do we, as a government, then say, you know what? It's just too darn risky. Parents, you don't get to make the decisions. Kids, you don't get to make the decisions about whether or not you're going to do the sports anymore. We can't trust you with that. We're just going to have to take that away from you because it's the only thing that we can do. It's the only thing that would be responsible. If it were about, we want to eliminate all of the risks to kids, that's something that we would be entertaining as a province. But we're not, because it's not about that. It's about punching down on trans kids because they make me feel weird. They make me feel complicated. I don't really understand it. And I saw some videos on the internet. And that's what it's all about. Dani was also asked at that press conference about the school notification piece.
Here are the school officials just dreading the paperwork required to opt every single student into every single lesson that touches on sex education, gender identity, and sexual orientation. I mean, some people might predict that teachers would now avoid those lessons to get around that extra work when they're already so busy. So can you explain why making it harder for children to learn about sexual health is a benefit?
Well, I guess if teachers are indeed talking to kids about sex every single day, every day of the school year, then I guess that this policy has demonstrated why we need to put it in place. But if, as I suspect, there is structured education on structured days, then I don't think it's a hardship for schools to say, this is the day that we're going to be discussing issues of sexuality, sexual orientation, and gender identity. It shouldn't be onerous. It actually should be fairly straightforward to be keeping parents in the loop on these issues.
It should be pretty straightforward. Now, as we're going to highlight later on the show, there's some experts in the teaching field who have said, nope, that's not the case at all. That's not what's happening here. But again, that's Dani thinking. You could see the gears turning in the moment. How am I going to turn this around? How am I going to weaponize this question, as opposed to actually addressing what the question is asking? Well, I guess if they're talking about it every day, well, that's the whole reason why we need to have this policy. So she justifies the policy by saying, well, if teachers are talking about it every day, then we need the policy. But I don't think that's what's happening. But we still need the policy? The logic gets very hard to follow, mostly because there is none. There's not any. Now, from that press conference, as we move along, I'd say we're about halfway. So if you need to take a bathroom break or fill up the popcorn bowl, now's a good time. Because it's a little bit of a detour. We're going to go down to sunny Medicine Hat, where Danielle Smith was scheduled to have a town hall. They're going to have a public town hall. They're going to talk about the things, all of the things, Medicine Hat, the important things. Nothing says transparency like issuing a recording ban for the town hall before it happens, which is what they did. Medicine Hat MLA's ban recording public town hall. Now, after the fact, after a recording did get out, and after everybody went, wait, what? They said, oh, no, it was a miscommunication, y'all. No, you could have totally recorded. It would have been fine. We didn't mean it like that. But after the fact is still after the fact. But there was one extremely powerful moment that came out of that. There's a small independent media organization in Medicine Hat called Community TV, and they decided that they were going to go in and stream it anyways. And thank goodness that they did, because in the middle of the discussion, the debate around these new trans policies, this happened.
Get off of that is if we disagree with trans folks transitioning, just because we disagree with it doesn't mean it's our right to stop it.
You're changing legislation. I'm sorry, I'm leaving. I've been to 2 funerals of children who've taken their lives because of this issue. 2 of them. Go to one of those funerals, watch those parents bury their kids. This is bad.
And those are the stakes. That is the reality. Being trans is by all measure an incredibly complicated, dissonant thing to deal with. Especially puberty, teenage, that whole thing is hard enough. But when you're in active conflict with how your body is changing, it's incredibly difficult. And for kids who don't have supports, for kids who hear people talking about what they're experiencing as if it's just a phase or as if it's just a simple choice, for kids who hear that kind of thing, it is unbelievably invalidating. And kids who are trans are also disproportionately targeted for bullying. And it's not just kids, as we'll discuss later, adults are also disproportionately targeted for bullying. But those are the stakes. And it's really unfortunate that the Premier of Alberta can't wrap her head around that very real thing. Which brings us to the next press conference.
Mylène from La Presse, Mylène Crête. I was wondering, why did you decide not to go with the transgender policy right away? In Quebec, for instance, they decided to have a committee to study the whole thing first.
Well, I think we have announced our intention on a number of policy items, and we're going to be putting the architecture and the legislation in place in the fall. So we've got lots of time for consultation, and we'll be able to get that feedback. But there are things about the process that I do want to investigate, just to make sure that there is that level of rigor that has been recommended. You are supposed to have a long period of time of counseling and living in the opposite gender or the gender of choice. And I just from some of the stories I've heard, I just need to make sure that that process is being followed. So there'll be a bunch of consultation over the next number of months.
So to be clear, the question that Dani was asked there was, hey, when Quebec decided to tackle this issue, they decided to put forward a panel and do some research and consultation with experts, and you didn't do that. So what's up with that? And Dani's response was, well, I've heard some stories, and it's supposed to happen over time, and I don't know if that's what's happening because I've heard some stories. So I guess we need to blow up the whole thing. But the callousness gets to be particularly obvious when she was asked about suicide rates.
Canadian Pediatric Society saying the policies you plan to implement are going to increase the risk of suicide for children in your province.
I mean, there's no question that these young people are very troubled and need that psychological support. I have a young person in my family who's transitioning, and so I know how important it is for family to be included in those conversations and for all the adults in their life to be supportive of them. And so I think that is the message that we're trying to get across, that it does not do a young person any good to have a split from their families or to feel like their families will reject them, because that's not the normal experience. People love their kids, and they're going to be supportive. We might not always agree with the decisions that they make, but we should start from a position of love and support. And if there are a tiny number of cases where somebody is at risk, then we have to have Child Protective Services step in to be able to keep that child from harm. So I would say that this is a debate that we have to have. It's a discussion we have to have. There isn't one right way to enact policy. We're mindful of what's happening in the rest of the world, in the UK, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, the Netherlands. These are places that went one particular path, and now they're trying to build a few more guidelines around some of this policy, and we think it's time for us to have that conversation here.
Now, again, there's a lot to unpack in that clip. First of all, Dani's approach of, yeah, I know these kids, they're super messed up. They're troubled. So, what are you going to do? We just have to get them the psychological help so they get through it. Again, it's that implication. It's that refusal to acknowledge. It's a medical state. It's that refusal to accept that this is more than just a phase. And I have to say, I don't know who the family member is of Dani's, but when she's saying, I have someone in my family who's transitioning too, and she looks down at the ground, it's an incredibly heartbreaking and revealing moment. And it speaks to how, as much as Dani wants to believe that the vast majority of kids, again, 62%, feel like they're incredibly supported, there's a lot of people who say that they're supportive in a performative way, but don't actually do it. Or they don't say it at all, because, again, 28% of kids don't feel that support. This clip also forces the question, hey, so now you're saying that we have child protective laws to intervene when kids are at risk, but how do we know if kids are at risk if, as soon as the kid says to a teacher, hey, I'm LGBTQ2S+, I'd like to use this pronoun, and then the kid goes home? When does Child Protective Services equate? When do they come into this equation in Dani's head? Because they don't come in until something has happened. And the fact that the Premier of the province of Alberta doesn't seem to have a firm grasp of that concept is yet another example that should give everybody pause. But in classic Dani fashion, there were some other questions that came up in this press conference, and she just straight up refused to answer them, and instead pivoted to other very strange things.
There amongst your federal colleagues, your UCP caucus and cabinet, for wading into all of these issues on gender, parental consent, gender-affirming treatments, all at once, and sex education all at one time?
Well, here's the thing. I mean, I think we wanted to make sure that we were watching what was happening in international jurisdictions and what was happening in the rest of the country. And having a discussion about pronouns is really just the beginning of the process. When a child changes their identity, it moves on to puberty blockers, then moves on to cross-sex hormones, then moves on to top and bottom surgery. That's the pathway. And so we had to have a conversation about what is the appropriate ages to be able to make those life-altering decisions. So that's part of the reason why we put it together as a package, so that there's some policy around health, some policy around education, and some policy around sport. I've been watching as well some of the incidents that have happened in sport. I just saw a video making the round about a rugby game where one woman was just picked up and pile drive by a much stronger transgender female athlete. And then the MMA fighter who was in the finals and just refused to participate in the final because she was up against a transgender athlete. And her view is that biological athletes who are born biological male, it'll have a punch that's 165% stronger. So we have to make sure that we're protecting the safety of women and girls in sport as well. So I would say that we wanted to be considered, we wanted to be thorough, we wanted to address all elements of this, as opposed to just taking it piecemeal. Because when a child starts down this pathway, it moves very, very quickly. And so that's why we want to make sure that we have the best support for those as they were going through it. And we're also supporting transgender individuals into adulthood.
How does your caucus feel? Well, let me talk about sports for a second and some scary videos that I saw on the internet. Now, I personally would love to know where she pulled the very precise 165% number from. I'd love to know where that came from, because that's a very specific number to claim that all trans athletes, all trans MMA fighters, of which I'm assuming there's like maybe 5, I don't know, I'm just speculating, they all punch 165% stronger than the average not trans female athlete. I have so many questions about that. But let's talk about the sports thing. Dani wants to talk about these preternatural advantages that people have in sports, and they haven't done any research except, wait, they actually have. They have done quite a bit of research on this, and what they've found is that when we're talking about people who are using hormone replacement therapy, almost all, if not all, of the advantages disappear after the first year of hormone replacement therapy. Now, there's probably some nuanced and careful conversation that needs to happen about, well, what goes on in that first year? There's probably some legitimate questions to be asked about that. If only there was some sort of ethical body that could have deliberated on some of these questions and tried to figure out the answer to some of these important questions. If only there was, there's that too, you say. It turns out that, yes, the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport has taken a look and come up with a whole list of recommendations for how these situations should be navigated in varying different sports and at varying different times of a person's transition. So for Dani to stand up there and be like, it's just the Wild West, nobody knows what's going on, is incredibly disingenuous and also patently false. If you're picking up on the pattern here, Dani seems to fancy herself as a bit of an expert on all things, but she doesn't actually know about the things. And all of this is made even more rich when I remind everybody that the question that was asked before she went into, I saw this video of this person playing rugby and they lifted him right up and then they threw him on the ground. And by the way, we tried to source out what that video was, but with a vague anecdote, it's quite hard. It turns out that there was a video that was circulating and is circulating again about an athlete who is biologically female, who was mislabeled by bad faith actors as being trans. She's not. She's a woman. And it turns out there's a lot of women out there what can kick a lot of ass. That's just the reality. But we can't say for sure if that's the story that Dani's talking about there, because she didn't provide any sources. She didn't provide any names. She didn't provide any circumstances. She just told a scary story about something that she saw on the internet. And boy, if that scared her, you should be scared too, because Dani wouldn't lie. Except she does. All the time. But then came the interview. And this is one of those things that you really have to, we're going to play some clips. Because Dani went with Vashi Kapelos on Power Play. And we're going to play some of the highlight clips that, again, really highlight just how disingenuous and misinformed and misinforming Dani is about these issues. But if you really want to see how a masterful interview is conducted, if you really want to see how to debate somebody who's going to gish gallop all the way through a series of questions, Vassy Capellos nailed it. She crushes this interview masterfully. So let's start with one of the first questions that she asked.
Of kids in Alberta under 18 who have received that surgery without parental consent?
The surgery, they do top surgery, yes, in Alberta, not bottom surgery, but there has been some organizations advocating for those treatments to be done younger and younger. And I guess I'm not comfortable with that, because if even an adult at 19 started the process and felt that she wasn't ready to make those decisions, it makes me wonder, how does a younger person feel? So you have to have a certain understanding, you have to go through a long process, and I just want to make sure that the protocols are in place.
I just want to make sure that the protocols are in place. Now, it's fascinating that Dani's going to say, well, I talked to this one person who tragically had a really bad experience of things. Therefore, I'm going to make these sweeping changes that are going to detrimentally impact a bunch of people's lives. But at the same time, she can say, there's no one narrative. Everybody's different. The solution for everybody will be different. That's why I'm making it all the same. It's fascinating that she can hold those two arguments at the same time and not have her head explode from the raw cognitive dissonance that one would expect it would create in a normal person. But somehow Dani's able to do both of those things. And there she acknowledges the problem that she's solving isn't actually happening, which is a pretty wild admission. She's bringing in these massive sweeping changes, and it's for nothing. That wasn't the end of that line of questioning, though.
Whether you had any evidence to base your policy on, specifically as it relates to kids under 18 in Alberta who are doing top surgery without parental consent. Because we asked your health ministry, for example, they were able to tell us that 26 Albertans in 2022 and 23 in 2023 received top surgery, those who are under the age of 18. But Alberta Health doesn't track whether those surgeries are related to gender identity or for medical reasons like cancer or breast reduction due to pain. So are you basing it on a concern of what will happen or actual evidence of what is happening?
A concern of what will happen.
So she's basing it on a concern of what will happen, because as we heard her say in the first clip, one of the big problems is there's no standards of care. There's no established, there's those too. And they're literally called standards of care. There are literally two major, and they're not small, by the way, documents that Canadian people who care for people who are dealing with trans issues. There are two documents that they're supposed to refer to. They're the standards that they're supposed to follow. One of them is a position statement from the Canadian Pediatric Society. It's entitled An Affirming Approach to Caring for Transgender and Gender Diverse Youth. And the other one is the literal World Professional Association for Transgender Health, Standards of Care for the Health of Transgender and Gender Diverse People. And these documents spell out a lot of what, these are the documents, again, that are in use, a lot of what Dani says that she's concerned about. They're very, very specific, especially when it comes to youth, what the criteria are for any kind of surgery. They want to see tracking of surgical outcomes. They want to see physicians having certain credentials. They want to make sure that they're trained and documented. They want to make sure that there's assessments for transgender and gender diverse people for risk factors associated with breast cancer prior to breast augmentation or mastectomy. There's a whole list, and this is just one chunk of a hundreds of page document that goes through and says, these are all of the things that we recommend. That includes extended periods of hormone therapy. That includes eligibility criteria. There's a whole list of things that they recommend as literal standards of care, because these things are they are absolutely things that should be in place. And this is something that the medical community has recognized. Hey, we can't just be going around willy-nilly with this kind of thing, because it does affect the rest of a person's life potentially with some of the treatments. So we should have standards, and they do. For Danielle to present it as not being the case is, again, either woefully misinformed, which is not how policy should ever be written, or it's deliberately misleading. And then she started to say the quiet parts out loud. Because one of the subtexts throughout all of this is, hey, you know what? Kids can't be trusted to make these decisions. Hey, you know what? Maybe parents can't be trusted to make these decisions. Hey, you know what? Maybe the people who are making these recommendations, who are providing these options, maybe they can't be trusted to make these decisions. Throughout everything that we talked about so far, there's been a subtext of the medical professionals are allowing this to happen. And they pressured that one person, allegedly. You can't trust the medical professionals. That's the subtext. But in the conversation with Vashi, it got out of subtext.
We've allowed the medical profession to make a lot of decisions without scientific evidence, and that's why I'm a bit concerned.
The medical profession is making decisions without scientific evidence.
Yeah,
Aren't they making them exclusively based on scientific evidence?
I wish that were the case, but that's part of the reason why the Tavistock Clinic was closed down, is because there was some concern that kids were making these decisions without having the appropriate level of time and the appropriate level of medical involvement. And so we want to just make sure that's not happening here. We don't want any child to be in a position where they're having a regret because they've made a life-altering decision. So we just want to make sure that we have the extra time so they preserve their choices.
In the case, though, of Tavistock, for example, it's not going to close until March 2024. The closure was delayed. And in its place, there will be 2 other regional clinics. They're not outright banning and going as far as you plan to with your government. So why are you relying on them and that example to back up the point that you're making, or the policy you're pursuing?
We're not banning anything either.
Yes, you are. You are banning puberty blockers for kids under the age of 15 when puberty is taking its biggest swings. You are banning top surgery for anyone under the age of 18. You are banning things. And for her to say that she's not banning things is disingenuous and wrong. And if you take a look at the whole Tavistock Clinic situation, there's a lot of different factors that go on there. But one of the biggest things that was highlighted in the report that resulted in the closure of that clinic was the fact that there was concerns that because of the number of people who were accessing the clinic, people weren't being able to get the amount and depth and breadth of care that they were supposed to. It was hard to access, which is why there are 2 clinics that are being opened to replace the one clinic. So to invoke the Tavistock Clinic as, you see, they've learned their lesson and you can't mess with the trans medicine is incredibly disingenuous and factually wrong, because that's not what's happening at all. But she opened that by saying that the medical practitioners are practicing without evidence. And if I was a doctor of any stripe, or if I was a mental health practitioner, psychologist, psychiatrist, social worker of any stripe, hearing that, I would be incensed. Because there's the Premier of Alberta standing up and saying, these medical practitioners, they're just making shit up as they go. And nothing could be farther from the truth, as we illustrated with the fact that when it comes to trans care, there are 2 massive documents that define the recommendations and define the standards of care. But it's not just physicians and teachers and trans kids and LGBTQ2S plus kids that Dani's going after. It's the parents, too.
To have any kids feeling regret, feeling like they were rushed, feeling like they made a decision without knowing the full consequences, and that just takes time.
Even if their parents offer consent? Like, even you're willing to say that the parents who offer consent for their children to go through these procedures should not have that right?
Well, I would say that the person who should make the decision is the person who's going to live with the consequences of it. It's not up to a doctor, it's not up to a parent, it's not up to a politician, it's up to that child. And that child has to be of an age and maturity that they know the consequences of what they're doing.
Make no mistake, what you just heard there was the Premier of Alberta saying that she doesn't believe that parents are capable, nor should they, make decisions when it comes to their kids' health care if there's any risk of adverse effects. It should be up to the kid when they turn 18. That's the whole argument that she's making right there. She's saying it very clearly. Parents can't consent. Oh, well, maybe she just misspoke. Nope.
Canada, there's no jurisdiction that
For bottom surgery,
for
correct,
bottom
but for
surgery
top there is.
and I guess that's the question of whether or not that's appropriate. I mean, when you decide to have babies as a woman, you may want to be able to breastfeed, and so when you're making a decision to have a double mastectomy, that's going to also have lifelong consequences. So we think that those are decisions that are adult decisions made at 18.
And a parent can't make that decision on behalf of their child.
No, I don't think that anyone can make a decision about what their reproductive health should be, except for a person who's going to suffer the consequences of having regret. And so we just don't want that to happen. We want kids to be able to fully understand all of the decisions they're making.
Now, with that being said, parents have no business making any decisions about their kids' reproductive health. I guess that takes the pill out of the equation, because the pill has all sorts of side effects and it can have long-term consequences. And to go back to our example from the beginning, given that strong position that Dani's taking there about nobody should mess with a kid's sexual health except for the kid themselves when they're 18, you would think that the government of Alberta would also be issuing a law saying, you know what, we're banning circumcisions in the province of Alberta. But a couple of reporters have already checked that, and no, they are not. So again, the principles and the standards that Dani's trying to say that she's advocating for simply don't hold true. They're convenient, emotional arguments that she's leveraging again against vulnerable youth. And again, it's no more clear than when Vashi brought up the question of, so what evidence do you actually have?
On a concern of what will happen or actual evidence of what is happening?
A concern of what will happen, because as I mentioned, one of the organizations internationally has now suggested a lower level of age 17 for starting surgery. And we just having seen some of the stories that I've had, I think that when you're going to make those kind of life-altering decisions, that should be as an adult. We do also, though, want to allow for those kids who've already started the process and those who are 16 and 17 to start down the pathway, because that's a level of maturity that I think many doctors believe that people can start making their own decisions. So we want to make sure that we're preserving the choices for kids. That's what this is all about.
But are you preserving the choices for kids? Because you're, again, now saying that you don't actually have evidence to support the position you've taken. You're just worried about what could happen.
And that's the reality. There is no evidence. There is no research backing up Dani's positions or her policies. It's what could happen, which isn't going to happen. Cherry picking a few crazy people who are advocating for ridiculous things doesn't mean that you allow it. Dani's done a spectacular job of blocking other evidence-based things that she doesn't agree with. Ask any member of the UCP caucus about the dreaded word safe supply, and they'll be very quick to say, that's not going to happen here. So even though there's evidence for a thing, because she has an ideological disagreement with it, she's blocking it. Why should this be any different? Because that's not what it's about. She's pandering to her base, and she's comfortable doing it at the risk and harm of vulnerable youth. And it's really, perhaps, if you watch the whole interview, which you should, you'll see that the interview starts and Dani said, or not Dani, Vashi says, hey, so we've got Danielle Smith. She's going to be answering some questions. She's in Ottawa, opening up a new office in Ottawa because somebody's apparently got to get paid. She didn't say that. I said that. And so here we have Danielle Smith, and then they roll the tape of the interview. And Vashi's very clear it was a recorded interview. But then they throw back to Vashi at the end. And I think that her expression sums it up the best. It's very difficult to top that because it does sum it up incredibly well. And it's important to realize that there has been not just a little condemnation about these policies. It would be pretty safe to almost use the word universal. There has been many editorials written. Alberta's unproven gender identity rules don't have kids' well-being at heart. Well, I think the last hour and a half has demonstrated that fairly clearly. But it goes much farther than editorials. The Alberta Teachers Association, very early on, came out and said the ATA has not been advised or consulted by the Premier Minister of Government officials about any proposed policy regarding parental rights or children's rights. Broad consultation on policies affecting the operation of schools must include the teaching profession. So in all of that broad consultation, we know that the teachers weren't consulted at all. Dr. Christopher Wells asked the question, consulted with whom? Certainly not any members of the 2S LGBTQ2 plus community. Any policy that harms 2S LGBTQ plus youth and violates their rights will end up in court. The Premier will need to invoke the notwithstanding clause to override basic human rights. Focus on the real issues. Brandy Rye, who's the president of, and I'm getting this wrong, I apologize in advance, the Alberta Parent Teachers Association. Should have written that down. When, where, how have parents been broadly, heavily consulted related to parental rights? Why are they being framed as rights versus responsibilities? Show the public the data related to these consultations, then broaden the consultation process before any policy, if any, is created. So we've got some pretty big stakeholders throwing in. And Dr. Christopher Wells took it a step farther, because he is actually the Canadian Research Chair, and he weighed in saying that these policies are going to result in kids dying. These announcements are a poison pill that will have devastating consequences not only on the lives of vulnerable transgender people, but on the entire 2S LGBTQI plus community. That's a direct quote from Dr. Christopher Wells. But that's just the teachers and the gays. They're just getting angry. Some people have vociferously said on social media. It's not. The Office of the Child and Youth Advocate of Alberta has come out and condemned these policies. United Nurses of Alberta. Nurses are naturally angered by the assault on human rights of a tiny minority of Albertans at the heart of this policy and the hurt and damage to our fellow citizens it is bound to cause. The Social Workers Association of Alberta came out and condemned the policy as well. Oh, but wait, there's more. We also have the Alberta Medical Association. Their section of pediatrics. So this is the branch of the Alberta Medical Association that specializes in pediatric care or the care of people under the age of 18. They came out and completely condemned it. The Alberta Medical Association's section of child and adolescent psychiatry came out and condemned it. The Canadian Medical Association came out and condemned it. The Canadian Pediatrics Society came out and condemned it in a 3-page letter. And it's important to note, when we're talking about the Canadian Pediatrics Society, we're not just talking about the Alberta Medical Association. We're talking about the society that represents pediatricians across the entire country. They came out and condemned it. But we're still not done. because the Alberta Psychiatric Association released a 4-page letter where they came out and condemned it. And I love that they used citations. The last page is all references, but they make it very, very clear that these policies that Danielle Smith has invoked are not in any way based in any kind of evidence. There is a group of 47 organizations representing a wide spectrum of organizations in the province of Alberta who has come out and condemned this. We have the experts at every level. We have the medical practitioners. We have the psychiatric practitioners. We have the social workers. We have the nurses. Everybody who would conceivably be involved in the care of a child, with the exception of parents so far, in the care of a child going through this process. Everybody who's bringing any kind of expertise to bear in the province of Alberta, their organizations have come out and said, this is going to do harm. But it's important to realize that the harm that we're talking about isn't just limited to the trans kids. One of the things that has to be one of the fundamental flaws of Danielle Smith's leadership is that she doesn't seem to have any recognition or awareness of the fact that she is leading by example. And when she normalizes something, there's other people who jump on that. And this is where we get to the greater risks that exist inside of this conversation. Because Smith is putting out the narrative that parents, even though she's dismissing parents' rights, it gets very confusing. Parents have the ultimate say over their kids, unless it's a lifelong consequence. And then the kids should be able to decide when they're 18. And it didn't take very long at all before a certain faction jumped on that.
Regarding minor children, such as medical treatments, piercings or tattoos, the use of tanning beds, or even the administration of Advil at school, all require the consent of parents. Minors do not, however, require the consent of their parents to get an abortion in Alberta, nor is it required for parents to even be notified about their minor child's abortion. What do you believe? Should parental rights include parental consent for a minor child seeking an abortion? Please select the option that most closely aligns with your view. Press 2 if you believe parental notification and consent should be required for a minor child to undergo an abortion procedure. Press 3 if you believe parents should only be notified without requiring their consent for a minor child to undergo an abortion procedure. Press 4 if you believe neither consent nor notification should be required for a minor child to undergo an abortion procedure. Press 5 if you are Thank you for your participation.
Thank you for your participation. Now, there's been a lot of questions about that poll because it actually violated the law by many reports because it didn't identify who the poll was, who was doing the polling, and it took a little bit of digging, but we got great reporters, and they did the digging. And so it turns out that the poll was actually done, it appears, on behalf of a parental rights group, an anti-abortion group. So there are people who are already looking to use this new policy of Danielle Smith's as a foothold for advancing the abortion debate, if you will, in the province of Alberta. And they don't make any bones about what they're after. But where it gets particularly alarming is the fact that the group is called Right Now, assuming that it's the one that's affiliated with the author, Alyssa Golub, because Right Now had a very heavy hand in supporting Adriana LaGrange in her first election. Adriana LaGrange is currently the Minister of Education, who has now control over all of the sex ed materials that we're going to see going into classrooms. And now we have this notification piece that parents have to be notified if kids change their name or their pronoun, and in many cases will actually require parental permission for the teachers to honor that request. But where it gets equally gross and equally far-reaching, and we don't have enough, we could do 4 hours and talk about the emboldenment that Danielle Smith has created among certain hateful, bigoted sections of the population. I spoke earlier about how vulnerable kids are disproportionately they're targeted for bullying, they're targeted for threats, and how the trans population is disproportionately targeted for bullying and targeted for threats. This was tweeted out by a trans woman, an incredible activist, and someone that we're looking forward to having on the show in the coming weeks. And I'm going to read it to you. One of many I've received in my inbox this week. Any violence that any trans person experiences in this province, I put directly on the actions of this government by their recent policies and alignment with cruel anti-trans advocates. Trigger warning. You're lucky I don't live near you. I would consider strangling your man neck till you stop breathing. This is what drives trans kids and trans people to self-harm. And it's important to highlight that this sort of thing has been emboldened by the Premier of Alberta, who doesn't take any responsibility. Nowhere in any of her public comments has she condemned the vitriol that has spewed out from the countless bot farms since this announcement was made. And there's been more than a few people who have noticed. There's been a major uptick in the number of accounts that haven't tweeted in years, but all of a sudden are weighing in on this subject. The Facebook accounts that are swarming any post that expresses any kind of support for the trans community, for the LGBTQ2S plus community. The Premier of Alberta has not taken any responsibility for any of these things. She issued a lighthearted little comment at the end of her infomercial where she said, talk to a grown-up. We've got Child Protective Services for a reason. Leaders lead. And make no mistake, Danielle Smith is absolutely leading right now. And she's leading in a direction that is absolutely going to get kids hurt, kids beaten, kids out on the street, and kids killed. It is truly stunning that a policy of this magnitude that has the potential for this much harm would be rolled out on nothing more than a few anecdotal stories with no consultation with the experts. Now, Danielle Smith has tried to say this isn't political. This isn't a political decision. I'm just trying to protect kids' choice. If this wasn't a political decision, if this was a decision that was truly in the best interest of protecting kids' choices and protecting kids' health, one would think that she would have consulted with the experts in those fields, but she has not. And the experts in those fields have condemned this policy, which only leaves a couple of explanations. One of which is Danielle Smith legitimately believes that she knows better than the entire medical community, better than the section of pediatric psychiatry, better than the section of pediatrics, better than the United Nurses of Alberta, better than the social workers. Danielle Smith, with her talk show background, believes that she knows more about than the cumulative knowledge and experience of all of those people who have worked in those fields, because she's talked to a couple of people, which should be a thought that is absolutely terrifying if it stopped there. But she also believes that she knows better than parents who want to be supportive of kids who are navigating being trans, of kids who are navigating being LGBTQ2S+. Danielle Smith knows better than those parents. And if she's willing to intercede at this level for an issue like this, you have to ask the question, where does it stop? And when you have somebody who helped get Adriana LaGrange elected, putting polls out into the field, allegedly, that are now trying to stir up the abortion conversation, and when you have the fact that this has branched out into restrictions against sport, private sport groups, private sport clubs are now being told that because Dani knows better than them, they have to change how they do business. It's a tremendously slippery and dangerous slope. And if it was an isolated incident, if it was one moment of bad judgment, then it might be easier to dismiss. But we're talking about a premier who has, at varying times, attacked the medical community, claimed the unvaccinated were the most persecuted group she's ever seen in her lifetime. She has wasted $100 million of taxpayers' money on a vanity exercise to buy children's meds from an organization that wasn't even authorized at the time to make or sell them in Canada, just to own the feds. She has stepped outside of the law to try to influence prosecutions. And now she's superseding parents who are acting in the best interest of their children on the advice of medical experts. It's important to note that this is not parents saying, oh, my kid has meningitis, so I'd like to treat them with horseradish. This is parents being able to access and receive the best advice from medical professionals who work in an evidence-based field. And if we've shown nothing else tonight, I hope one of the things that we've shown is that as much as Dani claims there's no standards, there are. As much as Dani claims it's the Wild West, it's not. And as much as Dani claims that she's only looking out for the best interests of kids, she's not. And that's the extent of our program. Like I said, we are looking forward down the road. Apparently the Twitter Spaces crashed. I don't know how long ago. But so we're not going to be able to do our live call-in tonight, but we're almost 2 hours into it. So what are you going to do? We'll be back next Sunday for the live call-in section as well. But we do want to have conversations if we've gotten anything wrong here tonight. And I want to be clear, demonstrably wrong. And that's how these conversations should be had. So over the next couple of weeks, in between doing our live shows and our roundups, we're going to be trying to engage with people who have lived experience, real expertise in all of these issues. Because this is too big to get wrong. And I'm going to steal a line from the former mayor of Calgary A few votes aren't worth a few dead kids. And my heart goes out to the parents and the first responders who are going to have to deal with that. Because it shouldn't be that way. Kids should be able to be kids, whoever they are, and be supported and not be insincerely told how valuable they are while simultaneously being used as political pawns. But you know what? I don't need to make that argument. I'm going to let Danielle Smith do it for me.
12, a child, if they've got a split home, can choose to live with mom or dad. So we recognize that a child as young as 12 can choose which parent they want to live with. At age 14, they can choose to have sex, as long as it's within somebody who's within a close age to them and not somebody who's in a position of authority over them. At age 16, they can become emancipated from their parents and make entire education decisions on their own. So there is, with these children, somewhere in the age of sexual maturity, somewhere above the age of 14 when they're in high school, where they really have the ability and right to be able to make their own decisions about the kind of support that they feel that they need to feel accepted. And most of them, their parents didn't know that they were out yet. Most of them knew that if their parents knew, that there'd be some consequences to that. One individual I spoke with, she said that 2 lesbian girls had come out at her school and had been kicked out of the school. Another young boy told me that he came out to his parents and his dad rejected him.
Just going to pause for a moment while we get a door closed up there. Sergeants, if you could close that door, please. We can hear some interruptions coming from there. Sorry to interrupt you, Honourable Member, but please proceed.
Another young woman was beaten by her father. So while I respect that we need to find a balance with parental rights and with religious freedom, I think we need to also respect that in the case of these mature youths, this really is a case of life or death for some of them. We really do have a number of youths who have nowhere else to go if they're not accepted by their community, not accepted in their home environment.
She knew it once. I can't help but wonder what happened.